All right, greetings from the Dark Continent. Conscious Caracal here, or Adams van Sail, here to shine a light on not specifically South Africa, but this time a corner of South Africa, in particular, about a southwestern, maybe a western corner down there. Geographically speaking, it might be the Western Cape, but we're going to be talking about specifically Cape Independence and the Referendum Party. Now, this is not a topic that's now debuting on my channel tonight. I have discussed this topic quite a few times with some familiar faces. You might recognize Robert Daigen in the past being one of them. And also my guest tonight, Phil Craig. He's also not a stranger on the show. I talked to him way back 4 years ago in 2020. We discussed the same topic, and we're going to do a little bit of a retrospective. Going to be asking him what's happened since and what the future holds. There's some big things happening now within the next few weeks. So welcome on the show, Phil. It's nice to be to chat to you again, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
No, thanks. And also nice to be back, and I'm looking forward to it too. So thank you.
I just forgot, just a quick introduction. So you are the leader. I said you are from the Referendum Party, but specifically for those that don't know, you are the leader of the Referendum Party and also the co-founder of the Cape Independence Advocacy Group, or in short, the CIAG. Is that enough of a summary? Or is there anything you wanted to add?
No, that's definitely perfect. We're not really big on titles. We just want Cape Independence.
So for tonight's discussion, in the previous discussion, we did cover a lot about your movement and your missions and your vision. But tonight, I particularly want to focus on the process, the means to the end. Last time we focused a lot on the end, but this time I want to particularly zero in on the question of how do you actually get to your destination and the viability of it. And maybe just before we get into the path ahead, let's quickly look back into the rearview mirror. You were on my show 4 years ago, 2020. It's amazing how time flies, but give us a bit of a summary for the audience that hasn't been keeping an eye on your movement very closely. What has happened in the past 4 years? What has been achieved? And what are some of the milestones in between in those 4 years since we last chatted?
Sure. Great. Thank you. Look, interesting one. I guess when we came into the movement, our real focus was to try and get Cape Independence much more into the political mainstream, to establish in the media, and to establish it really as a sort of a viable and well recognized political option. And I think we've been very, very successful at doing that. We wanted to secure a referendum. We haven't been, well, we have been successful. We did reach an agreement with the DA in 2021 that they would call a referendum, but they've subsequently reneged on that agreement. So we're kind of back at square one for there. And I think, and there are a lot of stuff around the fringes of that that we've then done. So, we set up the Western Cape Devolution Working Group, which was and continues to be actually an important measure in pushing self-determination together and saying, look, okay, we've got secessionists, we've got federalists, we've got devolutionists, we've obviously got differences in where we end up, but fundamentally we want the same thing. We want to take power away from Pretoria and deliver it to the people of the Western Cape, and there's an opportunity to collaborate there for everybody's advantage. So we've been involved in that. We've done a lot of polling work and hopefully demonstrated that there really is substantial support. This isn't just some pie in the sky idea. But ultimately here we are. We've now formed a political party, and that's because we got the Democratic Alliance as the government of the Western Cape, and therefore they're a key figure in delivering Cape Independence as far as we possibly we could. And ultimately, we got to a line in the stand where they weren't willing to go any further, and they hadn't gone far enough for us. And there were two issues that drove that. One was the reneging on the deal on the referendum on Cape Independence. For us, that was sacrosanct, and we're willing to accept that if the people of the Western Cape don't want Cape Independence and vote against it in a referendum, then so be it. That's democracy. We're not willing to accept that the Western Cape government, despite knowing that the majority of them want a referendum, are going to deny them one. So that was one. And then we had the Western Cape People's Bill, which was a bill that we wrote and was subsequently tabled by the Freedom Front Plus. And that was a bill that we wanted the DA to support. We worked with them for several months on that bill, and that was a critical bill in the fight for self-determination in one form or another, and ultimately the DA were unwilling to support that bill. So really, ultimately they weren't willing to call a referendum, and that they weren't willing to do anything significant on a compromise either. At that point in time, we then had to either put up or shut up, and an awful lot of people, an awful lot of work to get here, and so we're throwing the dice, and we've put our hat in the ring for the 2024 elections with the purpose of levering pressure on the DA to sort of get them over this line and get them moving forward again.
And this time you're on my show as 4 years later as a representative of the Referendum Party. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. I think last time I asked you whether you have any aspirations as the CIAG of starting a political party. I think, if I remember correctly, at that time your answer, I think, was no. I'm talking under correction. People can go check that episode for themselves. But now you are here as representative of the Referendum Party. Tell me a bit about the context. What's changed? What drove you to now start? What was the context within which this new party came to be?
Sure. No, well, look, I'm sure you're right, because it was never our intention to be a political party. And actually, ironically, we laugh, with the most unlikely political party, because we don't want political power. And we're here for one thing and one thing only. We're a single issue political party, and our intention is to force a referendum on Cape Independence to be held in the Western Cape. And I think really, in many ways, there's not much more to add on the why is the Referendum Party from what we said, previously. The DA made an agreement before the 2021 elections that they would fix the referendum legislation and call a referendum which included a question on Cape Independence. And ultimately they reneged on that agreement. And for us, that's kind of an absolute non-negotiable. So we have to leverage the DA to get that referendum. We know from polling that 79% of their voters in the Western Cape favour a referendum on Cape Independence. We had one agreed. When it wasn't agreed, we actually gave Alan Windey an ultimatum. We had 30,000 people sign a petition. We went to the Western Cape Parliament in October, and we said to him, we gave him 7 days to agree to call a referendum, yes or no. He said no, and we formed the Referendum Party. So, and obviously, whilst all that played out to the media, that had been, obviously, we'd be making some preparations for some time, and we tried to be fair with all the people that we deal with, so that the DA knew that was coming for a long time too. So it might have felt like, gosh, you only gave him 7 days, but I mean, the DA had months and months to sort of make their mind up to that, and effectively that was the sort of the final point. In 2021, the DA was, in a more vulnerable political position. They obviously hadn't done particularly well in 2019. It was after the Maimane era. Stina Hazen and Zille were trying to reconsolidate the party, and they were obviously quite fearful going into 2021, and they didn't want to fight with the Cape Independence movement, which at that time was really going from strength to strength. And therefore, we were able to negotiate this agreement. Unfortunately, after the elections, once they had a relatively good result and the ANC fell below 50% for the first time, politics being politics, it's not right. But I mean, we're real big boys, and we're in the real world. They went back on that deal. It is what it is. Here we are. There's no point in sitting and moaning about it. We had to do something about it, and what we've done is put up a referendum party to ramp up political pressure. And now we want to try and get the balance of power in the Western Cape to be able to force them, with hard political power, to call the referendum that ultimately we couldn't get them to stick to through lobbying.
All right, and as I said, we've already had this discussion on this topic before the Referendum Party existed. And last time, as I said, we talked about a bit more of the economic, political, geopolitical side of your vision, a bit more of a future-orientated conversation. You're well aware that I do have my own skepticisms about your vision. I did ask very skeptical questions last time. I'm not going to repeat them. People can go watch the previous episode, the 2020 episode that's still up on my channel. You can just search Conscious Caracal Cape Independence, and you'll find that episode. But I wanted to ask take a different angle with this conversation, and it's particularly the human element. I mean, we can sit here all day and talk about the economics and the politics of your vision and how you envision it working. What's the geopolitical significance of the Western Cape? I had that conversation with Mr. Daigen, Robert Daigen, last year, I think. It was in last year that we talked about the geopolitical significance of the Western Cape. But I want to ask you about the human element. What type of person starts to support Cape independence? Because we live in a country of failed mind readers. People often look at political parties, movements, organizations, and they claim to know exactly what's going on in the heads of the people that get involved with those organizations or that support those organizations. But I want to hear from your side, as someone that's deeply involved in this movement, what drives the people, not only the people within your party and your movement, but the people that all get behind your movement. Speak from the heart. Tell me what is going on in your minds to actually make sure that we don't just have a bunch of people claiming to be mind readers, but tell us, speak from your heart.
No, thank you. Look, and the honest answer is the Cape Independence movement is really formed, and one of the things that makes it so special is it's very, very, I can't say ordinary. I mean, many of them are highly qualified, but I mean, but ordinary people. It's not career politicians. It's not career lobbyists. Yeah, almost everybody in our political party have never been involved in political parties before. They don't come from a career in politics. There's a complete cross section of society. Do you know what I mean? From academia, from sort of people from entrepreneurship, from people through education. You know, it's a complete cross section of society. But really, I would say it's activists, and in many cases, it's activists of people who are doing it for the first time. You know, it's people who just genuinely care about this country, realise that we're in desperate trouble. They come across Cape Independence and they realise, gosh, this is the solution, and they start to get involved. And it's extraordinary. It was extraordinary at the CIAG, but I mean, we were probably an organisation there. We're not probably. The CIAG was an organisation that was much more about political lobbying. So it was, you know, one of our mottos was we had to influence the influencers. So we weren't really involved too much on the grassroots, or we did marches and so on. The Referendum Party is something different, and it's been absolutely extraordinary to just this Referendum Party is only 6 months old. It's not an old party, and 6 months in terms of a new political party is the blink of an eye. But it's been nothing short of extraordinary, you know, and anything that people think they know about the Referendum Party, they probably don't. You know, we've got a branch in Khayelitsha that does really, really well. We've got branches in the Cape Flats. We've got branches in the southern suburbs, the northern suburbs, across the Garden route, pretty well everywhere. We've got 96 branches, in the first 6 months. Now some are active, some not. And across all of that is just people who've just stood up and put their hands up, and we have a very I can't say decentralized, but I mean, we don't have a big capacity. We don't have huge amounts of money like the big political parties. We don't have this well-oiled machinery. We're 6 months old. We're flying by the seat of our pants. What we do is we just say, guys, this is the goal. This is what we're trying to achieve. If you want to help, put your shoulder to the wheel. And that's led to all sorts of things where people just come along and say, right, well, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. And people from the communities. So we've had blood drives, we've had park clearings, we've had we've had rallies, and in all sorts of places. When it comes to our poster campaign, we don't have some strategy worked out from head office where we send teams around there. We go to the branches and said, right, who wants how many posters and how many can you put up in your town, and we'll get them to you. So it really is a party that's built from the ground up, and everywhere I go, you just bump into people that are extraordinary. And you probably, we were in the news last week a lot over this border stunt where we sort of closed the border on the Western Cape, and actually, what do? We got a minibus, we jumped in our offices at Wellington, we drove for 5 hours, we stopped, we bribed, we had people from every walk of life in that minibus, every race, it was just fantastic. We had a great event, it was successful, everybody came back, and that is very much the story of both the Referendum Party and Cape Independence. Ordinary people determined to make a fundamental difference, and they're not politicians, they're not normal activists, they're people who want to save. They can't save the country, but they want to save the part of the country that can be saved, or one part that can be saved, because I don't accept that Cape Independence is the Western Cape is the only part that can be saved, but I think South Africa as a whole can't be saved.
Hmm. I'm glad that you can give us a bit of that insight for me and the audience, because I think that's what we need when it comes to other organizations, political parties, any type of movement. Is I want to get into the minds of the people that support it. I want to hear, but what is driving those people, rather than just, as I said earlier, depending on opinion pieces telling me, people that are not within that movement telling me what the people in that movement think. Um, Now, last time I told you, I proposed that I'm not going to repeat some of my questions from last time, but there is a question from last time that I really want to hear your thoughts on, because I think it's one of the biggest mental obstacles, I think, for a lot of people looking at your movement in regards to seeing what makes it different, and it's looking at other independence movements in the world or in history, recent history. So what I want to ask you is, what makes your movement different from other independence movements that have failed to achieve their goals, such as the Catalonians in Spain and the Quebecois in Canada? I think if you can explain that from your perspective, it would help me a lot to make sense of your optimism.
Sure. Look, so well, I'm going to just give you. I'm going to come to those because they're good cases.
Take your time. We got all the time in the world.
Yeah. So one of the things that I did just as an analysis to sort of help give people a sort of a broader context. So people often don't realize just how common secession is. You kind of focus on things. So in the last 50 years, around the world, there's been 81 independence referendums in the last 50 years, an average one every 7 months. And there's 35 countries have got their independence in the last 50 years, an average one every 17 months. So this, secession is something that just happens all the time. And if you look at a map of the world, whether it's Africa or whatever else it is, that's 100 years old, you literally wouldn't recognize it. So we kind of, because time moves slowly, we kind of sit here and it feels like we're in kind of this permanent situation. But that just isn't the reality at all. And the map of the world is in a state of constant change. It's just changing a little bit slower than we perceive. So there's nothing really extraordinary about countries seceding. It's part of the normal flux of human history, and within our lifetime, like I say. So you've got 35. I'm 55 years old. I don't know how many were in the last 5. I haven't checked that, but in the last 50 of those years, I say there's been 35 countries. When you look at those, every single one is different. They're all unique. There's no such, anybody comes along and says, this is how secession happens, or this is the process. It doesn't, because the circumstances in every single one are different. So you know whether you can look at what they call the velvet divorce, Czechoslovakia and or Czechia and Slovakia, who come along. They I don't think they even held a referendum, but they polled, and only 35% of the population favoured dissolution. But the two governments said, well, we're just going to do it anyway. And they split the country up into Czechia and Slovakia. They call it the velvet divorce, not any problems whatsoever, and a huge success. You look at Estonia, which has been a phenomenal success. And there are many other examples. The dissolution of in general, most of the dissolution of the previous Soviet Union was relatively peaceful, though obviously not in every case. Yugoslavia, much more troublesome. But the examples that you come to now, so Quebec's a very interesting one. In that Quebec is probably legally the most significant of all of the secessions. The case law, the key case law on independence is that Quebec. So, Quebec had 2 independence referendums. In the second one, there was a dispute because Canada said, well, if you vote to leave, you can't just leave the next day. And Quebec said, well, if we vote to leave, we are going to leave the next day. And there was a major court case. The Supreme Court of Canada gave a judgment on what should happen, and it invited in friends of the court, many of the leading experts in international law from around the world, and that became the case law, and still is the prime case law around what happens if what happens if the Western Cape has a referendum and votes to leave. How do we find what the outcome is going to be? Well, we go and look at that Quebec case. And yeah, some people argued that was an outlier, but when last year, or was it 2 years ago, I think it was last year, the UK Supreme Court had its judgment on the second Scottish referendum. It leant heavily on that Quebec case, and then any doubt that that was the sort of the seminal text of international law has gone. That is the text of Quebec is really significant. And the interesting thing with Quebec and Scotland, of course, is the only reason Quebec and Scotland aren't independent countries today is because they both voted to remain rather than to leave, which of course is a possibility in the Western Cape. But they're both model examples of how it should actually happen. You know, in a democracy, it was peaceful, it was democratic, they held referendums, and ultimately the people were allowed to decide, and did decide. The fact that they chose to remain rather than leave doesn't negate any of the process around it. Catalonia, in many ways, is an example of and I don't know all the details of Catalonia, so I'm not going to sort of think, but Catalonia seems to be an example of how to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. Catalonia was extraordinarily well poised to deliver independence. It obviously had a number of issues, but ultimately it rushed and arguably made some very, very poor decisions, and ended up then squandering a chance. I mean, the Catalonia had control of its own parliament, the Catalonia Parliament, but what it tried to do was hold a referendum, and the referendum was outlawed by the I don't think the Supreme Court, I'm not sure what it's called in Spanish, but anyway, the highest court, and then they went ahead with the referendum anyway, with the Supreme Court having said it was an illegal referendum, and then then at the end of that, then they said they were going to leave, but stayed the outcome. So they neither pressed their advantage nor didn't press their advantage, and the whole thing turned into a bit of a mess. So Catalonia was is certainly an example of something that you wouldn't want to follow that, and arguably Catalonia could have been more decisive or more patient, but actually it seems to have done neither, and certainly it wasn't a great example. But one of the very interesting things with the Western Cape compared to Catalonia, of course, is that the Western Cape is relatively unusual in that the South African constitution allows provinces to call their own referendums without the consent of the national government or the premier. Now, that wasn't the case in Catalonia, and it certainly isn't the case in Scotland. So why was Scotland going to the UK Supreme Court wanting a second referendum? Because they don't have the constitutional authority to call their own referendum. But here we are in South Africa, and the Western Cape does have the constitutional, to call a referendum, and the national government has no basis with which to deny it. So but as I say, every single one is different. The Western Cape has a relatively simple path legally to Cape independence. That doesn't mean it's simple politically, it doesn't, and of course, the law is a very complex thing, particularly when it comes around to secession. But that isn't really the challenge. I think the political issues are much greater in the Western Cape than the legal issues.
So thank you very much for that explanation on those case studies. It's fascinating history. I mean, I did read up a little bit on the Quebec case, on their referendum. So many interesting lessons there to be learned in regards to just referendums in general. But let's get a bit down to the brass tacks, the real practicality of what you're trying to achieve. When it comes to the Referendum Party, what are the bare minimum requirements for success for your party in 30 days when we have the election in May? What would the bare minimum requirements be for your campaign to be considered a success?
Well, look, I think probably if we get representation in Parliament, that would be a success. And if we fail to get representation in Parliament, that would be a significant disappointment and a significant setback to our cause. So that's kind of where we are. And it's very, very difficult to know what's going to happen. We have no experience in politics. We've never contested before. That nobody in our party has ever run a political party. We're way within the margin for error for polling, so we can't even get a sense of where we are. We just have to fight like demons, go to the elections and trust in the process. look, we've set ourselves some really challenging goals. In an ideal world, we've said we want to try and get 100,000 votes. Now that would be an extraordinarily, it would be a huge achievement. I think with only been 3 political parties since 1994 that have got 100,000 votes in the Western Cape. And and I think that probably is a stretch. And I would be absolutely delighted to get that. I think probably that may be ambitious, but I would be happy to be wrong. There are certainly people who think we will get there. But I think the Freedom Front Plus got in with 30-odd thousand. I think they got 35,000 seats and got in last time. I think Al Jamar got in at 19, although that would be by the skin of your teeth, and I wouldn't want to get that low. So it's certainly we'd love to get. I mean, if we could get 40 or 50,000 votes as a bare minimum, we'd be guaranteed seats probably in both the national and the provincial parliaments, and that would be a very, very powerful situation to be in. For what's a very small party that's only 6 months old, so that would be a success. If we put up the party and we don't get representation in Parliament, then we have a very weak hand moving forward. We're not dead and buried, but certainly that would have to say, well, look, that would be a big disappointment for us, and we'd have to sort of take stock and decide what to do next.
Now, as you said, you are bound by the will of the people in this regard. If you, as in the Scottish case or the Quebec case, if you this is not a referendum that you are what we're talking about here, but as in the cases where the people's vote does not say that they are in favor of your cause, in this election, if you were to go into this election and do not get the support that you need, the bare minimum, what would you take from that? What would the message be to not just your party, but to your movement?
Yeah, no, look, it's very difficult to say ahead of time because I think that so many other factors at play in these elections that make it very, 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 very difficult. What we've said to people from when we formed the Referendum Party is, if you want Cape Independence, you have to go and vote for it. And if people who do want Cape Independence, and there's lots and lots and lots of them, that I can absolutely guarantee you. People often look at the polling and say, look, hang on a second, the polling's not true. The polling is 100% true. There's nothing fixed in there. There are hundreds of thousands, probably well over 1 million people who support Cape Independence. Cape Exit have got 840,000 signed up ID numbers and all. So there's no question that there's people out there. If those people don't go and vote for Cape Independence, it's very frustrating for us, because ultimately, if people who want something don't go and vote for it, at some point, you're going into a poker hand with 2s and 3s, and then people want to negotiate that. So it would be very, very frustrating for us. But I also recognise that that we have some difficult challenges. One of the things we got, the big political parties are master manipulators. I think fortunately maybe that's coming back to help us. They've obviously been selling the lie of the multi-party charter for all they're worth for 18 months. And we often see on our social media people saying, listen, now's not the time for Cape Independence. We're right behind you. But let's just get the ANC out of power, and then we can deliver Cape Independence. And for us, it's an incredible frustration when people say that and say, look, you're absolutely deluding yourself. At the end of the day, if you vote for the DA who've taken a stand against Cape Independence, then we cannot deliver it. That's the reality. But I also think there's going to be what I'm calling the sort of the Noah's Ark syndrome. There's going to be a whole load of people who are sitting here not quite comfortable to vote for Cape Independence. And then after the elections, when we end up with an ANC EFF government or heaven knows what, then suddenly everybody will want Cape Independence. But I just pray that it's then not too late, because there won't be another provincial election until 2029. It's a difficult place to sit in, and our job is to convince as many of those people now to say, look, guys, you absolutely have to vote for Cape Independence if you want it. And that's why we put the Referendum Party up, because the biggest challenge we have is people in the Western Cape saying, look, I like Cape Independence, but the DA are doing a pretty good job of running it here. And actually, do you know what I mean? We don't want to let the ANC back into power, and that's something we're fighting constantly within our messaging. There isn't actually a lot of logic in that, but when we've created the Referendum Party, we've done our best to deal with that by saying, look, guys, we promise. We'll put it in our manifesto. We're never, ever, ever going to vote with the ANC. We'll vote with the DA. We'll keep them in power. We're not wanting to try and get power. But actually, if you want Cape Independence, you absolutely have to go and vote for it, because if you don't vote for it, what can we do? We can't deliver it. It won't be that we'll give up hope, but I mean, ultimately, it's sending somebody into battle and taking all of the bullets out of their gun. Let's see where we get to that, and we'll deal with what happens afterwards. But at this point in time, I would say things have gone far better than we could have ever imagined as a political party. It's far harder than we ever imagined. But I mean, a lot of our successes have just been quite extraordinary. There's definitely some level of groundswell building up. And, so I'm going to trust that we're going to have enough to get those seats. And then once we've got those seats, we'll be able to really then crack on and get the DA under a whole different sort of pressure to that they've had so far.
And on that note of things are much more difficult than you thought, and it's in some ways definitely more of an uphill battle than you imagined. I actually I have to add a little bit of a counterweight to your optimism, but I want to give you the opportunity to explain in detail. Sure. So I don't have the best memory in the world, but I do remember in 2020 when we had our conversation, I asked you what the timeline for the future looked like, and you said in 2 years, your vision for you think there will be a referendum on the table. It's 4 years later now, and I have that burning question at the back of my mind, and I'm going to ask it very, very simply and directly. What went wrong? What changed in that regards? 4 years later, there's no referendum, but as I said, you've got all the time in the world. We're not on radio or anything. You can give me all the details. What happened in the meantime?
No, well, and I think lots of different things. But first of all, let's just say within 2 years we were promised a referendum. So the referendum promise was made. I think it was in April 2021. So about 14 months after we spoke, I think we were delivered a referendum or promised a referendum on Cape Independence. The DA published their intention of bringing the referendum bill. Now, ultimately, I don't know what was in the DA's mind at that point in time. Did they intend to honour their word? Did they never intend to honour their word? I don't know. I think for us as a group, I mean, the Referendum Party, CIAG, ultimately, both still exist, and I'm still involved with both. I think we'd come along and say, well, okay, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. So I think I think that 2 years was possible, and we secured the agreement, but not the referendum. Equally, I mean, I think we started the movement. We didn't know what to expect, and clearly we haven't achieved it within 2 years. And it has been, I think, harder than you expect. I think all these things often are more complex than you've kind of imagined. What is the biggest challenge? The biggest challenge remains absolutely the same. The biggest frustration, the biggest challenge that the Cape Independence movement has is there's a whole load of people who really like the idea of Cape Independence. They've managed to either convince themselves or more likely be convinced by other people that it's not possible. And then actually, they don't do anything about it because they think it's not possible. And ultimately, they become the self-fulfilling prophecy. And actually, one of the biggest obstacles, if I could change anything, it wouldn't be the DA, it wouldn't be the national politics. It would be that group of people to say, if you want it, vote for it. If you want it, at the end of the day, you mustn't talk yourself out of what you want. History's full of people who've delivered the most remarkable feats, but they do it through belief and not disbelief. So I think there's a mixture. I think there's part to say, well, look, probably we weren't too far away in terms of there because it was deliverable. But ultimately, here we are, and we haven't got that. And so my bad. I have to own that. And yes, I would much prefer to have delivered it 2 years ago. But here we are, and we definitely haven't given up fighting. It's taken longer than we hoped, and I was wrong.
Hmm. But yeah, now looking to the future, taking our eye off the rear view mirror, for the audience that might not be as well versed in the technicalities of this, sketch the path forward. You are called the Referendum Party. What does that path towards a referendum look like practically, rather than just looking at it simplistically in regards to vote for it and you'll get it? Get a little bit into the details for the audience. I think it's a fascinating topic.
Sure. No, absolutely. Look, so yeah, and also for us, at the end of the day, we're learning as we go. And actually, there was, if there's one area where intentionally, otherwise, I allowed myself to be duped by the DA. It was into believing that the referendum legislation needed to be changed in the first place, and it's now absolutely clear that the referendum legislation never needed to be changed. There's nothing wrong with the referendum legislation, and if Premier Windy wants to call a referendum, he can call one today. That whole changing the referendum legislation has turned out to be a giant red herring that has bought the DA 2 years so far, and more since. They've pulled us into that story. That to a certain extent, they've pulled your organisation into that story, where we've all got into the referendum legislation has got to be changed. And actually, when we've gone back and we've taken legal advice, and as you've taken legal advice, we've all found out we didn't need changing at all. The referendum that Windy can just call the referendum legislation. And for anybody who wants to sort of understand more about that, there's a great article written by Martin van Staden from the Free Market Foundation. I think it was published both on the Daily Friend and in Politics Web, where he lays out in great detail why it is that Alan Windy can call a referendum now and he doesn't need to change the referendum legislation. So ultimately, what is the key to delivering a referendum? Well, it's putting pressure onto Alan Windy to do something that he doesn't want to do. So the crux of the Referendum Party strategy, or the primary strategy, because obviously you can only control your part of the equation. But the essence of the Referendums Party strategy is that we want to get the DA below 50%, somewhere around about 48% would be ideal, away from salvation from other parties, and to then have the balance of power and to force it into a Cape Independence coalition. And to that, we've signed an election pact with Cape Exit, the NPO, with their 840,000 members. And also with the Freedom Front Plus. And we've agreed that ourselves and the Freedom Front Plus will hunt as a pack. Cape Exit will try and get their voters or their members to vote for one or the two of us. And actually we'll get enough of a voting bloc that we then force the DA, when they now need to come and form a Western Cape government, that they need our support. Ultimately, we're quite happy to support their agenda. We're not far away policy-wise. The Freedom Front Plus aren't. We're single issue anyway. All we want is a referendum on Cape Independence. So that's the first point of call. That the DA sit here on 48%. They look around. They want to make a deal with the ANC. They want to make a deal with the EFF. They can't make one with Patriotic Alliance. They can probably make one with the ACDP, but outside of that, the ACDP probably get 1.5% of the vote, and that's where we come at 48%. Action SA maybe have got a couple of percent, but ultimately their biggest partner in the Western Cape in municipalities is the Freedom Front Plus, and they're standing with us on this issue of Cape Independence. So that would be the first. Point of call. And the easiest point of leverage. Obviously, if the DA get more than 50% of the vote, or they're close enough to 50% that they can make an alliance without us, then obviously we have to go into the provincial parliament and start fighting within the provincial parliament. But obviously, even at that point, it's now infinitely easier when we're in the system. Cape Independence suddenly becomes the point of every debate, because the DA is very vulnerable on a number of issues that actually they've been able to get away with. One of the ones where you'll see between now and the elections, we'll start to attack the DA quite a lot on is, for example, the DA have been in power for 15 years in the Western Cape, but economic growth over the last decade has averaged 1.1%, and 1 in 4 people are unemployed in the Western Cape, and actually there's an argument, well, if you're in power for 15 years, are you not ashamed of economic growth of 1.1%? And of course, what's the argument with the DA? Well, the argument is, well, we don't control economic policy, and that's absolutely right. That's the whole point of Cape Independence. If you hold a referendum and we take Cape Independence, then we can control economic policy. So there are issues that the DA is very, very vulnerable on, but have had a relatively free ride on that in national politics. And that's something we absolutely are not going to give them to a free ride. And it will be our intention to, not that we're wanting to get the DA out of power, ironically, we're wanting to make them answerable to the Western Cape people, because actually that's a shocking statistic. And if you have 15 years in power, you must fix those issues. And we know it's about the authority. We know it's about agency and power, but that makes it all the more important for the DA to act in the best interest of the Western Cape people. And I think, I don't know how many bills it is, but I think in those 15 years, the DA have passed 1 bill in Parliament in 15 years. And suddenly, in the 15th year, they bring along this Western Cape Provincial Powers Bill after we wrote the People's Bill, which they opposed. So now you have the DA in 15 years never bringing a single bill on autonomy, and actually suddenly they're under pressure and they start to take action. And I think once we're in Parliament, they're the things that we can bring to the table all the time, and suddenly the Western Cape Parliament will become a much more hostile environment, because we won't be going there to make up the numbers or to be a silent partner. We're going there to make the Western Cape Parliament become the voice of the Western Cape people, and not just a springboard for the DA's national ambitions.
Now, mentioning the Western Cape Parliament, let's say you have a successful independence referendum. Can independence be declared and legitimized without the national parliament's consent? I think this is a question that a lot of people have voiced in the live chat here in some form, someone in the audience here tonight. And also just a question in my mind that I want to use the opportunity to ask is, just to put it simply again, if you are successful with your referendum, can independence be declared and legitimized without the consent of the national parliament, or do you need them to play along and give the legitimacy and the consent?
No, and I'm really glad you asked this question, because it's a very easy to answer. Is absolutely Cape Independence can be declared without the consent of the national parliament. I'm going to give more details because there's there's a lot more to the story than that, but that's unequivocal. And this comes back to the 2 judgments we talked about. The Quebec judgment is one of them. The other critical judgment is the International Court of Justice in 2010 declared that there's no prohibition on the unilateral declaration of independence. Any country can declare itself independent, and in fact it goes through history to show that the notion that you need the parent state is absolutely nonsensical. And you can just look through history and see that in many occasions, countries come into existence even with the national government strenuously opposing it. So there's a key judgment in with an advisory opinion, but there's a key judgment of the International Court of Justice that makes it absolutely clear that the Western Cape can go it alone. It doesn't need South Africa, and it's one of the issues that is really badly understood by people. Now the answer is, can you and should you? Two different things. Now clearly the Western Cape going its own way and putting 2 fingers up to South Africa is really an action of last resort. So that wouldn't be but it's a useful point to start. So we start the discussion understanding that the Western Cape absolutely can leave South Africa without South Africa's permission. It doesn't need a change of the constitution. It doesn't need the National Assembly to vote in favor of it. It can just leave, and there's a key international court judgment that absolutely establishes that. Then that's a really useful, because then we understand the parameters of any discussion that takes place afterwards. Because people kind of think, well, people like Peter Voss will kind of say, well, South Africa can just ignore you. And of course, well, South Africa can just ignore the Western Cape, and the Western Cape can just ignore South Africa. That's not, that's the act of last resort, but it's possible. What actually should happen, and that comes back to the Quebec, and there's a really key passage. I think it's 74, but I could be wrong. Maybe it's 174. It's for me, it's the pivotal passage. It's one paragraph of that Quebec judgment. And I think anybody who wants to understand Cape Independence should go and read that passage. I regularly put it on Twitter because it describes exactly. So I think we talked about this earlier. What was the situation? The Quebec Parliament was saying, look, you know what, if we vote to leave, we're just leaving, and screw you, Canada. And Canada said, you're not leaving. We have to talk. And then the court then, with all of the international experts coming in, considered that decision. And the paragraph was absolutely fascinating. It's just the perfect way of understanding how it would work. So what it says, first of all, is it doesn't matter how many people in Quebec voted to leave. Quebec can't just leave and dictate terms to Canada, because it's part of it's part of the Canadian order, and actually your rights under the Constitution can't be divorced from your obligations. So that will be the first part that says, the Quebec can't just leave. The Western Cape can't just leave the next day. But then it goes on to say, but exactly the opposite is also true in a democracy. Canada cannot prevent Quebec from leaving, so long as in doing so, Quebec respects the rights of others. And then it goes on to pack out the issues that actually what there should be is a set of negotiations, none at all of which are predetermined by law. Nothing in law is predetermined on any issue. And that must take into account the rights to each other, minority rights, and all of the other issues. And then it finishes and say, well, nobody says that'll be an easy set of negotiations. And obviously that's the case. So what would happen after a referendum on Cape Independence? The Western Cape government would be mandated by the Western Cape people to pursue independence. And we know from that judgment, that Quebec judgment, that South Africa is not in a position to say no to it. But now there has to be the terms of the secession has to be negotiated between the Western Cape government and the South African government. Now, obviously, if the South African government then chooses to act in bad faith, then we come to the International Court judgment, which was a bit later, the Kosovo judgment, and the Western Cape could in that situation secede. But Brexit is a great example of this, to look at how Brexit played out. And you had all this talk of a hard exit, but ultimately a hard exit was just a disaster for everybody. And the Western Cape just leaving would be a disaster for everybody in this situation too. So it's going to be in everybody's best interest, both South Africa's and the Western Capes, to reach a negotiated agreement. And whilst everybody might be very Arachat, can I say at the beginning, ultimately you're going to end up in a situation where both sides are forced into finding an agreement that works for everybody, because the consequences would be a unilateral declaration of independence, or actually the alternative, of course, would be that the DA-led Western government would then just submit. But I mean, that would be electorally disastrous. So I think that's unlikely too. So I think we're likely to see a negotiated exit, but that's the parameters. But ultimately, that's the very, very long answer to your question. But the short version is yes, the Western Cape can leave without South Africa's permission. And the notion that there has to be a 2/3 vote in the national parliament to allow the Western Cape to leave is absolute nonsense.
Right, and I see people in the chat. There have been multiple people that mention international recognition. I think that we touched on this in our previous chat in 2020. Now, again, I think I'm going to repeat this point, because I think it's absolutely critical to whether your vision succeeds or fails. I know Robert Daigen has come on board on your mission for Cape Independence in recent years, but I remember one of his points about 4 years ago was that the Cape must prepare for the total absence of international recognition. Those were his words back then. Next time he's on my show, I'll ask him if he still thinks the same. I'll give him the opportunity, but I want to pose that question to you in regards. I think it would, if your mission or your vision has any chance of succeeding, you'll need some form of international recognition. Now, as I said earlier, I'm playing open cards in this regard. I tend to think that you're going to struggle to get international recognition, but I'm very open to being convinced otherwise. So I'll give you the opportunity. Explain to me and again, dispel my pessimism on why the Western Cape is actually positioned to get international recognition, and where would that potentially come from?
Sure. Okay. Well, let me first start with this. So I haven't heard Rob's comments, but I would absolutely disagree with him if he thinks there's any viable route to secession without international recognition. International recognition is the final arbiter. I mean, ultimately, you know, without international recognition, there is no country. That is the final decision. So as soon as you have a contested secession, the Western Cape says it's an independent country. South Africa says no, we're not letting you go. Without international recognition, you're dead in the water. So on that part, I agree with you in principle, absolutely, and I would completely disagree with Rob. One of the challenges with international recognition in reading the room, of course, is that it's illegal for any other country to effectively make any declaration or anything before the time. They can't interfere in the internal affairs of other countries. So you can't sit down with Britain and say, if we seceded, would you support us? You kind of have to go and read the room. But over the last few years, we have engaged with what you can do is engage with political parties and with politicians. And I've always been absolutely amazed at how positively disposed people are towards Cape independence. So my feeling is that there's going to be very little issue with international recognition. I think it's one of those things that it's not going to be everybody, but I think particularly the countries. Well, I'll come to those countries now. I think there are plenty of countries that would give the recognition. What I think has helped Cape independence is in the last 2 years, the geopolitics have completely turned around. And while some terrible things have happened, the things that have happened, and you wouldn't wish them on anybody, have been very advantageous to Cape independence. So one of the things that we've always focused on with Cape independence is this ideological divide between the Western Cape, which always votes one way, and South Africa, which always votes a different way. And that has been illustrated in a number of ways. And the Ukraine-Russia crisis was a great example, where the national government was conducting military exercises with China and Russia, and the Western Cape government was banning Russian diplomats from all of its functions and painting its town hall in the colours of the Ukrainian flag and inviting in the Ukrainian diplomats, which, by the way, is completely unconstitutional and illegal to have done so. So you end up in this situation where you've got this you've got this changing of the international order. And the Western Cape is much more aligned. I'm not going to say it's aligned with the West, but it's much more sympathetic to the West. It's certainly a lot less antagonistic towards the West. Whereas obviously, South Africa has a relatively antagonistic opinion. And then you've seen all of these issues, where the Suez Canal has been blocked. You've got issues in the Middle East, and the Cape Sea route starts to take on a much more geopolitical significance. Now, currently, the Cape Sea route falls under BRICS because it's part of South Africa, but under an independent Western Cape, there is the likelihood they would either be neutral, which would probably be the preference of many people, but certainly more sympathetic to the West than currently. So I think there will be an awful lot of self-interest, because people often say, look, international law is much more politics than it is law. Whatever the law says is almost irrelevant. Countries act out of their self-interest, and there's been an awful lot up in Angola, in Congo. You're starting to see a real play. The Americans are making a real play to try to get back, to get a foothold on the continent, to try and negate the influence of the Chinese and the Russians. And I think a lot of those things make Cape independence rather attractive to many countries. Now, I don't know what the significance of that is. I clearly can't say, and I clearly haven't had those conversations at a governmental level. But what I can tell you is I've probably spoken to politicians from maybe 20 countries in the last 4 years, and I've had a very, very sympathetic hearing from all of them. In fact, there's nobody sat down and said to me, we don't think you'd get recognition. I think people, some of them think it's easy in their country, others think that it would have its challenges. But I certainly think it's not something I worry about. Of all of the things that I sit and think, gosh, how are we going to get that done for Cape Independence? International recognition isn't one of them. But that isn't certainly easy, of course.
Right. And yeah, well, it's not a referendum, but your next big test is in 30 days. It's the election, and you're going to be standing. Let's just get a little bit into the nitty gritty of that. Will you be just on the ballot in the Western Cape? I can't imagine anywhere else.
No, we're on all three ballots. We're on the national ballot, we're on the Western Cape ballot, and we're on the regional ballot. So Western Cape provincial, Western Cape regional, on the national ballot. You're about to see, we're just about to send up, I think we've got posters up in Pretoria already, and we've got about another 50 posters or something going up to Pretoria as we as we speak. No, look, there are, Cape Independence has a lot of support outside of the Western Cape. So from our point of view, one, it's useful for us to try and capture that, because it helps us getting our national seat. We're picking from a bigger pond. So that helps, and also we kind of have a bit of a national agenda. I mean, we're definitely not going to Parliament to make up the numbers. We have a very provocative agenda in Parliament. Our role as a single issue party, we're not going to govern. We're going to turn the system on its head. In the Western Cape, that obviously has one connotation, but in the national Parliament, we're going to poke the likes of Malema and Ramaphosa in the eye, and deliberately so. We're going to fight for a particular set of values. We're vehemently opposed to African nationalism. The national parliament is full of African nationalists. A lot of the parties in that national parliament go along to get along, because perhaps that's part of their agenda, because they feel they have to work with those African nationalists. We despise African nationalism. We despise the African nationalists, and we can't wait to get into Parliament to really piss them off, and to start making a stand for real non-racialism, real self-determination for different communities, and so on. And one of the things that we want to do beyond that is we want to table a constitutional change to allow citizens to instigate referendums, because here we are in the Western Cape with one man, Alan Winde, holding the Western Cape people to ransom over a referendum, and we'd like to propose the New Zealand model. So we've got two things that we want to do in the National Parliament. One is we want to turn the thing on its head, and we want to cause some positive mayhem. I'm not talking about EFF type hooliganism, but I'm talking about uncompromising language, standing, and you've seen that from the Referendum Party too. I mean, the ANC despise us, the EFF despise us, because we've just spoken our truth and we refuse to apologize for it. We in fact we've gone out of our way to point out that, for example, in South Africa, that the biggest issue at the moment is black racism, African nationalism, and many ways white racism has been dealt with because it's socially unacceptable, and therefore we've kind of got that passed. But now we've got this issue with African nationalism and black nationalism, which actually is a disease on society. It prevents us and it needs to be confronted, and absolutely that will be part of our role as a party that's founded on non-racialism. And like I say, and then this constitutional change, which it'll be interesting to see how much support that is. It's possible it could get cross-party support, because I think for other reasons people might fancy the idea of citizen-instigated referendums, and we want to propose the New Zealand model, which that says that on any particular issue, if you can get 10% of the specific electorate that deals with that to support your issue, then the government must hold a non-binding referendum on that subject. And that's a very powerful way of empowering people.
Well, Phil, we can talk for another 5, 6, 7 hours on this topic. But I want to give you the opportunity now, as we wrap up, if you could leave the audience with any idea or thought or message, what would that be here at the end of this conversation on your vision of an independent Cape?
Well, I'll tell you what I'm going to do, and some is I'm going to tell you we ran some focus groups, and I'm going to tell you what happened in the focus groups, because I hope that helps people understand, if they're undecided, why it's really important to vote for the Referendum Party and not for the DA. So what we did is we ran professional focus groups, and we brought in DA voters in the Western Cape, and we wanted to understand, could we convince these people to vote for the Referendum Party? And we went through a series of a barrage of questions, and the first question we asked people was, were they going to vote in 2024? They all were. The second one came along and said, who were they going to vote for? No, they were going to vote for the DA. Why were they going to vote for the DA? No, look, they did a good job of running the Western Cape, and when their pipe broke, somebody came. Would they consider voting for somebody other than the DA? No, they wouldn't vote for anybody other than the DA. Then at the end of that thing, and you know, at that point you would have felt hopeless for the Referendum Party, because no DA voters at all wanted to vote for anybody. It was almost like a cult-like status. But then we stopped and we put that to one side, and we said to all of those DA voters, listen, tell us about the sort of country you really want to live in. Describe what's important to you. Now, we want it to be crime-free. We want to see an end to racialism. We want to finish. We don't want affirmative action and BE. We want the schools to work. We want to. That was great. And then we said to people, okay, if you vote for the DA, will you get that future? And every single voter, maybe one or two exceptions in groups, but let me say 90% of DA voters said no. If we vote for the DA, we're not going to get the future that we want. And that became the key. And if you look at our strategy for the Referendum Party, we talk a lot about the future, because we recognized that people are voting for the DA because they can fix stuff now. But actually, if they think about how they really want to live and they look forward into the future, they know that the DA cannot provide them the future that they want, because they just don't have the power and the authority to do anything. And ultimately, here we are in the Western Cape now, where the EFF is the fastest growing party in the Western Cape. You know, in 10 years' time, there won't be a DA government in the Western Cape to save us if we don't do something now. And that was the issue that came out, and our campaign is often on that. That's what came out of our focus groups. And if people want to have a future on the African continent, then in the Western Cape, the only way that's going to happen is if they're going to vote for Cape independence. So people must, if they want that future, you've got to vote for it now while you've got the chance. You know, the DA vote is the safe vote. It's I'm just buying myself a few more years. But actually, if you want to have a future on the African continent, then we have to take control of our own destiny back. We can't leave our control in the hands of the national government. We have to take control now, whilst non-racialists and people who have a relatively liberal, free market or market-orientated economy, whilst we form the ideological majority, we have to take control of the Western Cape now so we can preserve our way of life. Because if we don't, in 10 years' time, the Western Cape will be African nationalistic, and it'll look just like the rest of South Africa. And actually, all that we hold dear, that specialness of the Western Cape, will be gone, and it'll be too late. It'll never come back. So it's now or never. In fact, our Afrikaans posters are about to go out this week, and they say "now of nooit." And it isn't any more simple than that. If we can do this, we can deliver Cape independence. But if you want it, you do it now. You vote for Referendum Party in this election, because in 2029, well, John Steenhuisen himself said, don't take for granted there's going to be free and fair elections in 2029, because there probably isn't.
Well, Phil, thank you very much for your time. This is, like I said, not the first time that we had this type of conversation on the topic of an independent Cape. You're well aware of my own skepticism or criticism or critical questions, but having conversations with people with bold ideas and a lot of passion behind those bold ideas is the name of the game for me on this channel. So thank you very much for sharing your insights, and again, to give your perspective from someone on the inside of this movement, on what's driving you and what makes you optimistic, what makes you see a bright future and a vision on the horizon. Thank you for your time, and also thank you to everyone that tuned in. Thank you for your comments. Thank you for your questions. And Phil, I'll be keeping an eye on your party and seeing what happens in this election. Interesting times.
Don't keep an eye on it. vote for it, Ernst. But thank you very much. It's been a great opportunity, and I appreciate it. Great to chat as always.
All right. Thank you very much. And if you like these types of conversations, you can subscribe for more. Also, if you want to take part in this conversation and it's no longer live, you can no longer use the live chat. You can still go to the comment section below this video, leave your comments and thoughts on this idea of an independent Cape, a referendum, maybe the upcoming election. I read all of those comments and I really appreciate them. So yeah, leave your thoughts in the comments as well, and share with friends and family and on your social media if you think they'll find this conversation interesting. I also deeply appreciate everyone that shares all of these episodes. All right. I hope everyone enjoys. If you're South African, I hope you enjoy your day off tomorrow, public holiday. And Phil, I also hope you have a great week ahead, and we'll chat again in the future. Good luck. And also, cheers, everyone. God bless.
Thanks, Ernst.